Hey everyone, welcome. We're going to get started here in just a second. All right, so welcome everyone. We are going to have some fun today. We're going to be tying up some dry flies, and basically we're going to do the exact same pattern, but we'll just change colors and that'll change the imitation. This is also a special event for us. We are very grateful to be joined by the Virginia Museum of Natural History. They're running a fly tying contest, but it's actually a really cool thing that they're doing in general. So they are working on kind of creating an exhibit of the different types of insects that you can find in some of our local rivers and streams here in Virginia. And I believe they're doing the Smith River as an example. And what they've asked is, fly fishermen have always, forever, been trying to imitate local insects and hatches and be able to use that to target various fish. And here in Virginia, we're lucky to have the native brook trout, which these patterns that we're going to tie here today are really good for being able to go after and target. So we're going to kind of go through and talk about what makes a good dry fly pattern. For us, at the top of that list is going to be easy to tie. There are as many dry fly patterns as there are words in the dictionary, and every variation in between. But what I like to tie are the parachute style, because they're really simple to change. I can change the size and I can change the color. And the shape is relatively consistent with what we would expect from an insect landing on the surface. So when a trout, or really any fish, looks at something, it's really going to be looking at just a couple of key things. And depending upon the species, certain things are more important. They're going to be looking at, hey, is this the right size for what I'm going to try to eat? Is this the right shape of something that I identify as food? Is this the right color as something I identify as food? And then oftentimes too is, hey, is this where I expect to find my food? As an example, we wouldn't expect a crayfish at the surface of the water, just like we wouldn't expect, something like a dry fly at the very bottom. Although a drowned, mayfly or caddis can actually be very, very effective, or a stimulator. In fact, I'll pick on Jeff. One of his favorite things to do is to run a dry fly, especially a stimulator, just under the surface to kind of imitate that drowned insect. And that can be really effective as well. So trout, and we're going to be focusing on trout for a lot of the conversation today, because that's what these patterns are designed for. They're really going to be keying in on just a few of those. They're only going to have a second or two, especially in the case of a high flow stream, to see a pattern. And they're really quickly going to identify, does it look like the right shape or size and color? And they're only going to have a split second to be able to do so. So we can get away with a more simple pattern and still be able to very effectively target those fish. Now, if we're on a slower moving stream or river system, that's when getting closer to that imitation becomes more important. All right, so let's go over the different materials before we get into tying. I know a couple of us like to tie along. So today we're going to be using just dry fly hooks. So these are, if you care, just an extra fine dry fly hook in a size 10. There's a couple different types of dry fly hooks that are out there, right? These are extra fine. So the wire between these two, let me switch over so you guys can see. There's a big difference between and so this fly is tied with just a kind of a standard dry fly hook. And then we have this extra fine wire. This extra fine, if I get it into the right plane, is actually thinner and more flexible. The nice thing about that, you know, if you're going to be tying something like this, is it's going to float easier. It is, there's less metal, and so it's less dense, and it allows you to float more easily in a high flow stream, but it's not as strong. So there's a trade-off. You know, if I hooked into a very large, let's say brown trout, like in Mossy Creek or something like that, that hook isn't going to be quite as strong and robust as you know, the dry fly hooks that we're going to be tying on today. So lots of different variations that are out there. Another fun thing is with this pattern, if you tied on, let's say, a curved hook, then you know, a hook with a slight bend in it, then you can end up tying something like this, which is known as a clink hammer. So again, exact same way that we're going to tie this fly here, except no tail, and we get a completely different type of dry fly pattern. So by learning how to tie a parachute dry fly, you can imitate a vast majority of insects that are out in our streams, in mountain streams or spring creeks or what have you. All right, so next material is thread. I like a thin thread. So by thin, I'm going to be talking about a UTC 70. I'm going to be talking about something like a 6/0 or an 8/0, depending on where you get your thread. I'll have different naming conventions. And the color, I mean, I try to match what's going to be my dry fly dubbing. It's not as critical because most of the thread should be covered by material and won't show through. So if you only have one color, tie with that color. We need what we call a post material. So our post is just a stiff material. Traditionally, this is usually tied with something like a calf tail or a kip tail or something like that. But we've got some really nice synthetics that are out there. This particular synthetic is called Zlon. Nice and stiff, really nice for tying up parachute posts. We are going to need some type of dubbing for the body. I recommend getting yourself a pack, a multi-pack of different colors of dubbing. So by changing this, right, we're going to be tying with this pale yellow to start with. And that's going to tie up a sulphur, imitation, sulphur mayfly. Here's an orange. So if I want to tie up an October caddis, I just don't put a tail on my fly, and I have an October caddis, right? You know, we've got what we call a PMD, or pale morning dun. We have, you know, your grays are going to give you your Adams colors, and then we can even do a rusty spinner. You know, so when you get a multi-pack like this, you can fill a box very quickly with lots of different imitations for different bugs, depending on what's flying around, and have a pretty good chance of being able to get a bite. And the last thing that we have to talk about is hackle. Now, I recommend two different types of hackle. The tail material, the quality of hackle doesn't matter as much. So I kind of recommend just using woolly bugger hackles. Scrap pieces are great. I actually have just a mess load of scrap pieces of hackle that I've been collecting as we've been tying all this time. And I'll take a few of those fibers, and you'll see how that works here in just a minute. And that works great. Now, the hackle that we're going to wrap around our parachute post, this hackle, the quality of it can make a big difference. So this is a nice dry fly hackle that I have on this fly, very uniform in length, and a very, the individual barbs or quills of the feather are actually pretty dense and close together. This creates a very nice dry fly that's going to float very well. So those, and when I first started, I tied everything from just the woolly bugger packs, which are nice because they have lots of different sizes in them. But since I do tie more dry flies now, you know, I've went ahead and I've gone out and I've gotten a few half capes. These are nice because they have many different sizes. We'll talk about sizing a feather here in just a minute. So some very, very small fibers up here. So if I want to be tying something like an 18 or even a size 20, I have that size, and then I have longer feathers to tie something like a size 10 or a size 8. You can go, if you say, you know what, I only like to tie, let's say, a size 16. You can actually go out and get individual packs. These are graded for size 16. This is a much more cost-effective solution, but you can only really tie 1 or 2 sizes of flies with it. And this is designed for a 16. You could get away with tying something a little smaller, like an 18. Tying a size 14 would be a little bit harder. The last thing that I'll recommend, if you really do get into fly tying, and you really start to enjoy tying dries, then you may want to just go ahead and invest in some type of introductory hackle pack. This is nice, right? Because it's got 4 different colors in it of various sizes, some small up near the top and some larger near the bottom. So yeah, and Jeff says he actually ties with 100s packs. Like I said, that's what he means by a 100s pack. These are your most cost effective. And if you say, I just want to tie in size 10, just go out and buy 1 or 2 packs of these in different colors, and you'll be good to go and be able. They're called 100s because you should be able to tie 100 flies with them. Yeah, so now that we've kind of gone through the materials a little bit, we can actually get started with tying our first fly. But before we do that, I got to put a little bit of a plug in for Healing Waters, because we got 1 or 2 people that may have joined us that may or may not be familiar with Project Healing Waters. Like I said, we're doing this as a collaboration with the Virginia Museum of Natural History. So Project Healing Waters is a nonprofit organization whose mission is for basically serving our disabled veterans and recovering active duty. We simply try to enable veterans to learn how to fly fish. So that includes being able to learn how to tie your own flies, learn how to cast a fly rod, learn how to build your own fly rod, and learn how to actually go out and fish. So those are what we call our core activities. If you want to learn more about Project Healing Waters, I encourage you to go and look up Project Healing Waters online, and we also have various groups on the Facebook page. Specifically, this is Project Healing Waters Charlottesville, so we serve the greater Charlottesville, Virginia region. And for those of you who are joining us from outside of Project Healing Waters, welcome, and we encourage you to tie along. And feel free to, if you have any questions, put them in the chat. All right, so now that that plug is over, let's go ahead and get down to it and have some fun, right? So first thing we need to do is put on our hook. Now I always debarb. On dry flies, it's that much more critical to debarb first, because it's just easier when you have a bare hook. So let's go ahead and get my hook in place. Cool. And now we're going to go ahead and lay down our thread base, right? So this should look pretty familiar. This is the way that we do most of our flies. I'm actually going to start all the way up at the front by the eye of the hook, and I'm going to work my way towards the back. Just cut off my excess thread and lay my thread base all the way back to where that barb of the hook used to be, or just before the bend of the hook. This particular fly I don't want to have curved. I want it to be more straight profile. If I had a curved hook, obviously I may bring it down a little bit more. But for this particular species, again, we're going to be tying up a sulphur mayfly. We're going to just tie on the straight part here. So our sulphur mayflies, they're a lot lighter in color. They're usually maybe slightly yellow, very pale yellow, or some of them are a little bit darker. Like I said, in October, you'll find some of them that are more orange in coloration. And then others can be, very close to white. So I like to use like a white hackle and then a slightly yellow colored body. And I find that allows me to kind of skirt the range of the different flies that are out there. So in order to do this, now this is just a regular hackle feather. This is not what we'd call a dry fly feather. And you can see here, right? It's not uniform in length. It tapers down and starts where it's real wide and then tapers as it goes along. Versus a dry fly feather, which is, this is the feather that we're going to be tying with for our post material. See how that is uniform in length until we get all the way down to the tip where it finally starts to kind of taper out. That's going to allow me to tie many flies with one feather. And we're actually going to prepare this feather, so I'll show you where I like to start so I can get as many flies out of it as possible. But for the tail, like I said, I don't need to use my more expensive hackle. I can just use this scrap piece that I had on my bench. And I'm going to grab maybe a half a dozen fibers or so. And I'm going to go ahead and just pull those off. So they're now in my hand. Hardest part about this is transferring your hands and getting it where the tips of that hackle will be able to go off the back end of the fly. Now, if you're asking how long should the tail be, well, it depends on your preference. So some mayflies will have very, very long tails coming off the back. Others will have tails that are a little bit shorter. In general, I like to try to be around the length of my hook shank. And so I'll just kind of get that in place. And then I'll go ahead and very carefully capture in these. And as always, I know a lot of us, you've been on here, you've seen me tie. I'm always pulling on the upstroke, right? So almost no pressure on the down. When I come up, that's where my pressure goes. And you can see it on how the hook moves. See, when it comes down, the hook's not really coming down. If I were to put pressure, then it would bend down. And when I pull up, that hook point comes up. That keeps our materials on the top of the hook. If I were to be putting that pressure, for those of you who aren't familiar why I did that, if you put pressure on your thread coming down, it has a tendency to roll the materials around the hook. So if you struggle with your materials kind of spinning around the hook, it's probably because your thread tension is too high coming down. All right, so now that we have our tail in place, we're going to go ahead and tie in our post material. So again, we're using this Zlon material. It comes in a big bundle. Let me switch just so you guys can see. It comes in a big bundle like this. And I always recommend, anytime you're getting something that's attached to a zip tie, never undo the zip tie and never just pull it out from the zip. So if you need a new strand, you just kind of pull it away from that main section or hank or whatever you want to call it. And then you just bring your scissors in and trim as close to the zip tie as possible. Now, the cool thing about this material is it kind of naturally has like a melted, switch again, like a melted section. So this material stays together. Now the rest of this is just kind of like free flowing. So what I can do is if I work from the kind of free end, then I can keep tying along here until eventually, I run out of material. So again, I can get multiple flies from one strand. In fact, I've only ever purchased one thing of Zlon, and I've tied hundreds of dry flies. And what you'll see here is actually two different lengths. This is one that's on my bench. It's been used to tie, I think, about 3 or 4 dry flies now. And then this is the one that I just cut off. So I'm actually going to use up the last of my my strand today. So yeah, we try to conserve materials where it makes sense. Where it doesn't make sense, we won't. All right. So for our post material, we are going to tie it a little differently. We're going to tie it with the ends sticking out away from the tail and up past the eye of the hook, right? So usually when you tie in fly tying materials, you always lay that material so it's going backwards, away from the eye of the hook and back towards the tail. But post material, we are going to tie in the opposite direction. far as the length is concerned, this is entirely up to you. I like to have it much longer than I need it. So at least as long as the shank of the hook, if not a little bit longer, and then I'll trim it afterwards as necessary. Now, when I go to tie this in, I'm going to do a loose wrap first. You guys may not have seen that because my finger's in the way, so I'm going to do it without holding it. Usually I'm holding it down. A loose wrap first. This is going to allow me to kind of collect that material, and then when I go and pull from the top, it's not going to roll around that hook shank, right? So I'll show you what happens. If I just start wrapping normally, see how it's now underneath? Well, that's not where I want my post. I want my parachute post on the top. So if you're finding your material roll, like we said, it's probably because you are pulling too much on the downstroke. All right, so loose wrap first, and I pull on the upstroke. I'll put about 3 wraps in, and you can see that it's still on top. If you need to, you can even grab that material and push it back into place. So now I've got lots of Zlon coming off the back, lots coming off the front. So what do I do from here? Well, in order to make a nice tapered body, we can actually use our parachute post as a way to help guide that shape of the fly. And insects naturally kind of have a tapered body. So to do this, what I do is I'll take my scissors, and I'm going to put my scissors down at an angle and cut this material at an angle. So I'll kind of hold it together, take my scissors. Be careful not to cut my hook, right? Because I don't want to dull out my scissors. And so now I've got this taper in the back part of this material. Now watch what happens when I work my thread backwards. Again, still pulling on the upstroke. As I come back, everything gets captured quite nicely. And I've got kind of this tapered body. Now I'm going to clean that up a little bit. But that parachute material has allowed me to really have like this really nice starting point for when I go ahead and I dub the fly. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to convert this so where it's not sticking out the front, but our parachute post is sticking straight up. So how do we do that? Well, it's actually pretty simple. What we're going to do is we're going to advance our thread forward. We're going to grab this post and pull it back. So I'm grabbing all of the post material and I'm pulling it backwards. Now I'm going to start just laying wraps right in front of this parachute post. You know, maybe a dozen wraps or so, right? And now it sticks straight up in the air. What we did was we built a little thread dam in front of this parachute in order to get it to where it will stand straight up. The other thing that we want to do is we want to make it so instead of all this kind of craziness flowing out here, we want to collect it and have it where it's given us a nice base for when we go ahead and we tie in our hackle. So the easiest way to do that is to actually wrap your thread around this parachute. And this is going to be probably the most difficult technique of this fly. So, and this causes some people some grief. What I recommend is trying to be as very light as possible. So if you can control your thread tension such that you can lay wraps around this post without even holding it, then you know that you're doing pretty good with your fly tying. But most likely what you'll need to do is kind of lay your wraps in like this, where I move my hand when I need to, then I grab it. Move my hand when I need to, then I grab it. If I pull too hard, you know, it's not going to just start unraveling on me, which will happen if just like that, right? So when I started, this is how I did it. I kind of just took my time and started wrapping around it. What we're looking to do is wrap up this post at least 1/8 of an inch. You can go as high as you want. The higher you go, the more difficult it becomes because it loses some of its stiffness. But once you get a nice section, what we've done now is we've laid a thread base that's going to make wrapping the hackle around our dry so much easier. If there's only one tip you take away, well, there's two things if you only take away from the way I tie dry fly. I hope this is one of them. And then the other is a secret in order to make this fly more durable and keep the hackle on. But stay tuned for that one. All right, so now we've got our post wrapped. We've got our tail in, and we've got a nice tapered body for our dubbing. So now what we're going to do is we're going to switch over and we're actually going to move to our dubbing. Now, the last few flies, some of you were on for us, and you saw how I like to pull dubbing out of one of these boxes, but some of you may not have seen it. So we're going to do this. I'm going to do it with, first starting with this is called a pale yellow, because I think our sulphurs are a little bit lighter, but I do have the sulphur orange that I could use as well. But I'm going to tie a second one here in just a minute and use this orange. So on the underside of these boxes, there are a series of holes. So I use my whip finishing tool, and I will actually stick it into that hole and hook some of this material and start to pull some of it out. That allows me to be able to grab as much as I need, and I'm going to grab it in very small wisps. You'll see that on this other camera here in just a minute, and I will add more. For those of you who haven't done a lot of dubbing, start with a small amount, and then you can always add dubbing. It's a lot harder to take dubbing away. All right. So this is always the hardest part to show on camera, but I'm going to do my best. So when you go to dub, what we're trying to do is get this kind of wispy material wrapped around this thread in what we call a noodle. You'll see what we mean by that here in just a minute. There are ways to make this easier. Some people will use wax. Davey McPhail, he's a brilliant tyer. He's one of the people that inspire me and that I watch a lot on YouTube. He always has just a glob of wax on his hand that he can wax his thread. I do not use wax. What I've actually found is if I can just dampen this thread, it will work similarly. Maybe not as well as if I use dubbing wax, but good enough. Easiest way to do that is just wet your finger a little bit, and then you can wet that thread. And now when you go ahead and you put your material on, it's going to stick a lot easier. So we just lay that material along the thread, and we start moving our fingers back and forth. Now, if you find that it's not quite behaving the way you want, or it's sticking to your fingers, wet your fingers. And that's going to make it so much easier. What we're doing is I'm taking my fingers, how do I show this the best? And I'm kind of, here we go, moving my fingers in this kind of direction. And what that does, see how that dubbing is starting to roll around that thread? It makes that noodle, right? So you can kind of see in the background, that's what I'm doing, moving my fingers back and forth. And now I've got that wispy material where it's going up along my thread, and I'm ready to go ahead and start wrapping it around my fly. Now I always find that I do the first maybe 1 or 2 wraps, and I'll get this kind of poofy section, if you will, right? It's really hard to get the very end of that dubbing nice and tight. So I'll come back and kind of rewrap, and I'm kind of pulling on that dubbing a bit to help tighten that up. Notice how it's less poofy now? So if you find that your dubbing's coming off of your thread as you're going along, just take a moment and spin it a little bit more. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start working my dubbing up the fly. If I notice I got a section that doesn't look like it's tapered as nicely, I might go back and hit a section or two. You can see here I've run out, right? I'm back to my regular bare thread. Like I said, it's easier to add dubbing than it is to take it away. So I'm going to go back to my box, take another wisp out, wet that thread, and do the same thing I did before. And I'll do this a little bit faster this time. Just kind of make that dubbing noodle. And so now we can go ahead and continue, and you don't even notice on that fly that I had to do that. Okay, so we got up to the parachute post. We're going to go ahead and finish, and I kind of put the exact amount of dubbing on that I needed to where we're now ready to start tying in front of the parachute post. What we want to do here is we want to get our hackle, our dry fly hackle, remember that's that nice uniform piece, prepared and ready to go. And then that's going to allow us to cover up with that dubbing this hackle feather. So it's going to give us a much cleaner looking body. So I need to prepare this feather. When you pull a feather off of a, this came off of this kind of half cape, you're going to get a feather that's going to have kind of a thick section. Let me switch over because it shows up better over here. Kind of a real thick section with real long bits, and then eventually that feather evens out. You also will feel the difference. Now this won't show up on camera well, but this section here, it's very, very stiff, while this section here is a lot more pliable. So the feather will kind of tell you, based upon feel and look, where you can go ahead and do that initial trim. And I'm actually going to do that trim right here. And that's all I need to do to prepare this feather. And now I've got a nice long section that I can tie multiple flies off of and be able to really utilize this piece. So how do I know that this feather is right for this size? Well, some people will have a hackle gauge, and you can buy those and you can have that on your vise, and it'll tell you really, really well. But the other way that you can do it, and this is the way that I do it, is if you take your feather and you just kind of press it around the hook, you'll notice that these fibers are a little bit longer than the hook gap. So I always say as long as the fibers are as long as the gap, you're okay. And you can even go up to a gap and a half, and these are kind of somewhere in between. And so that to me is perfect for this size of fly. That's what I've always used. Everyone is different. Some people like really long fibers. Some people like them to be a lot shorter. And depending on the insect, that can make a difference as well. Because when that fly is floating on the surface of the water, let me grab one of the ones I've just already finished so you can kind of see this. The trout's going to see it in this way. And so there'll be dimples on the water. And obviously I don't have a tank of water, but there'll be dimples from where these hackle feathers touch the water, and that kind of gives that imitation of legs or the wings if it's spread out. And it is something that the fish may key in on. All right, so the next part about this is going to be kind of measuring to where the front section of this fly, or the feather, like I don't want to measure it where it's sticking way out past the eye of the hook. I want to measure it where there's a little bit that's on the shank. That tells me that I can fully capture it. And I'm also measuring at an angle. That angle is important. So in order to finish preparing this, you guys might be familiar. You kind of just come in and you just cut some of these fibers off, makes this little comb pattern, allows my thread to get in between it and really capture it, right? All right. So why am I tying this in at an angle? Well, I'm going to need to bend this hackle around this post. It's easier to bend something if it's already slightly moving that way than if it's fully horizontal. So all I'm doing now is I'm just capturing in that feather, bringing my thread back, and then I'm going to take my feather and bend it vertically. And now I'm going to start wrapping up that parachute post to the very top of that thread that I've laid. And then I'm going to go ahead and bring my thread back down and be right down on the bottom. Now, if you are like me and you got a couple little strands sticking out, now's the time to come in, not cut your thread, and just kind of trim those out of the way. So my hackle feather's going straight up above my parachute post. It's out of my way, and now the front of this fly is exposed so that I can actually dub it to get back to the middle of my fly with my parachute post. So I'm going to advance my thread up to the hook eye, and I'm going to go ahead and dub back. By the way, you can have fun here. So you can do a fly. Now I'm going to grab that clink hammer as an example, to where the front of the fly has a different material on it. It's showing up, that's a little hard to see just because it's there we go. So this actually has some peacock pearl on the front. It's a different color, and then it's got gray dubbing on the back of it. A little hard to see just because it's not in perfect focus. So you can certainly do that. You can do a different color of regular dubbing. For us, with our sulphurs, they're pretty uniform in color. But that's a different way that you can make a color variation. So kind of fun. All right, so the dubbing is the same as always that we've been doing. Kind of wet our thread a little bit, wet our fingers a little bit. Takes just enough to make our dubbing noodle. We're going to go ahead and start dubbing back. Again, I like to pull that dubbing just to make it a little bit tighter in that beginning. I'm going to work my way back until I'm right at the parachute post. I need just a little bit more. This is did not quite have a perfect amount. Easy enough to add a little bit. And there we go. Now, I need just the tiniest bit. See here, I'm just a tiny amount just to cover up that thread point. There we go. That's a lot better. So, tying off a dry fly is something that always causes a lot of heartburn for different people. I'm going to show you one of the easiest ways to finish a dry fly. And so what I'm going to do right now is I'm actually going to tie off my thread. And that's as simple as you can just put in a half hitch. Ignore the way that half hitch just went in. Well, that went terrible. It like slipped off my finger because I was looking at the camera. Okay, so don't do a half hitch like that. Do a half hitch in a regular way, and you can kind of tie that around. You can put 2 or 3 half hitches on. If you happen to have a really nice tool like a dowel rod, you can put a half hitch on really easy in that way. Right, and you want to do 2 or 3 half hitches, and then you can just cut your thread off. If you're adventurous, you can try to do a whip finish. 1, 2, 3. Right there as well. Now, obviously, I'm putting lots of knots in, right? So I'm creating this kind of thread hotspot, if you will. For you, that shouldn't happen because you should only be doing enough that this thread's not going to come loose. And you're going to cut your thread off. And you might say, hey, crazy, you didn't wrap your hackle around and you've cut your thread off. Well, that's because we are going to use a little bit of super glue on the post of this fly, and that's going to lock our hackle into place. This is so much easier than trying to whip finish your thread or put in half hitches or what have you after you've laid your hackle on this post. And I use enough super glue that kind of is covering around this post. This is also going to make your hackle so much more durable because it's going to lock each turn of this hackle in place. So, and I use, like most things are this gel control super glue because it's not going to harden right away. All right. So at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to wrap our hackle around our parachute post. So to do this, it's just as simple as I just take it and I start wrapping around. Now, you want to be careful. See how this post is not moving? If I was really pulling it, then this post would start bending. This is all about making sure that you are just taking your time and only putting as much pressure on as you need to ensure that this wraps around that parachute post. And I'm trying to put one wrap of hackle right below the last wrap. And when I get down to the bottom, I like to put maybe an extra wrap or two in it to really make sure this is going to be a high floating fly. At that point, I'm going to take my hackle pliers. Remember this trick? If you don't have your hackle pliers on already, you just kind of lay them there. And I can take my hands off the fly. What we've done is we've allowed the weight of the hackle pliers to hold that feather in place while that super glue dries. And when it finishes, we will have our dry fly with our hackle really nice and secured around our parachute post. And we can just cut off that excess material and be good to go. The only other thing that you may want to do is handle this kind of motley crew of a parachute post. So after I've wrapped in all that hackle, then I'll kind of come in, I'll give it a little haircut. I still want a good bit of this post sticking up just for visibility. So I'll just kind of come in and just cut it. This has got a nice healthy amount. If you struggle to see this is kind of what we call an indicator, this parachute post. If you struggle to see that when it's in the water, try to think of a color that's the easiest for you to be able to see. So I'm going to say maybe a nice kind of hot pink will stand out a little bit more. The fish can't see this because this is floating above the water. So they're not really going to see what this is, but this can make it easier for you to see. So I can come in with this marker and I just kind of run it back and forth to where I just kind of put this highlight in, right? So now I've got a parachute post with a different color on it. And you don't have to use pink, right? I mean, you can use any color that you want and make that a little bit easier to see if that white kind of disappears in that foam or that film where you may be fishing this fly. So, okay, so we're going to see if we've had enough time, and we have. So I'm going to go ahead and trim that hackle. And it didn't all come unraveling on me because it is secured to our fly. And that's it. That's all there is to a dry fly. A lot simpler than what it may seem. Really simple if you use that super glue trick. That's the second tip. The first tip is cutting that parachute post so that it helps give you this nice tapered body. The second tip is to use that super glue around the parachute post to really help that hackle stay in place. It will actually give you a more durable fly. So we're going to tie another one more quickly, and I'm going to tie it kind of with that October kind of coloration with that orange. And I'm actually going to omit using a tail. So I have one that I've tied before with a tail. This kind of is like a nice high floating mayfly imitation. But we're actually not going to tie it with a tail because that one will be able to imitate more of a caddis, and the October caddis is something that is happening right now. So Stu, you asked, can you do the last part without super glue as well? Yes. So I will not do the super glue. Well, I'll do the super glue trick, but I'll also show you how to finish a fly without super glue on this next one, Stu. So you can see. So if you don't have super glue, you can still see how to finish off the fly. But that super glue trick, I tell you, it actually makes the fly look nicer too. It's a lot cleaner because you won't have a tendency to trap any of the fibers. But you'll see what that looks like here in just a minute. All right, so let's go ahead and get my hook on, and we'll tie this a little bit faster. So I'm going to use an orange colored thread for this, but it's still like a UTC 70. Same thing, we're going to start from the front. And by the way, this is, remember in the beginning I talked about that extra fine wire hook? This is that one of those hooks. So you can see it moves so much more, right? It's a lot lighter, it's more high floating, but it also is a lot more flexible. So you can really see when you get it on the vise that difference in the wire gauge thickness. So I'm going to lay my thread base all the way to the back. And like I said, we're not going to tie in a tail. So mayflies generally have a tail versus a caddis, which doesn't have a tail. So it's a pretty easy way to turn a mayfly pattern into a caddis pattern. Just cut the tail off. In our case, don't tie one in. So we're going to advance our thread up. You know, I failed to mention where I like to tie in that parachute post. So I kind of like to tie up around maybe so if you divide the hook, let me not use my finger. If you divide the hook shank in half, I like to tie kind of up near that halfway point in between it. So it's almost 3/4 of the way up. That's my preference. Some people will tie it right in the middle. Some people will tie it much closer to the front, and that also varies on the pattern. So you can take and change the way that a fly floats in the water based upon where you tie in this hackle, which again can help you to take the same pattern and the same steps and imitate a different type of insect. All right, so let's go ahead and tie in my parachute post. So again, tips going towards the eye of the hook, going forward. That loose wrap is that first wrap. Pull on the upstroke, put in 3 or 4. If I need to adjust, I can, but my parachute's on the top of my hook. Again, I want to have that tapered body, so I'm going to cut at an angle. And I'm going to go ahead and, that's what happens when you pull too hard. Go ahead and start capturing this material. If you need to, you can grab it and readjust if it's starting to kind of pull down along towards the bottom of that hook shank. And I want to capture all of this in. And there we go. I'm not worried about it being super clean right now because I'm actually going to have to come back to do the dubbing. So I'm going to grab that parachute post. I've advanced my thread right behind that tie-in point. Make sure I grab all of it. I've got a couple fibers trapped underneath the hook. So if you use your bodkin, you can actually pull those out to where you get all of the fibers. Now I'm going to lay maybe a dozen wraps or what have you up just in front of my parachute so it sticks straight up. And now start to wrap around the parachute, and we need to make sure we're not going with too much tension or pull all those wraps off. If I need to advance my thread, grab that parachute post and then pull back. Put enough wraps in so that I can have a healthy amount of hackle. Again, I'd say at least 1/8 of an inch. You can go up 1/4 inch if you want. You can do more than that if you want. The more hackle you put on, the better it should float. And in our mountain streams, they have a faster flow, and so you want something that has the ability to stay afloat in heavier water conditions. So now I'm taking my thread and bringing it back towards the tail. I'm going to use the thread to taper the very end of this body a little bit better. There we go. And so now it is ready for me to go ahead and put my dubbing on. We're going to use this nice sulphur orange. Makes a really good October caddis imitation. And there actually are mayflies as well that carry this coloration. So, like I showed you with that other fly, you can put, a darker colored tail on this and have a nice mayfly imitation for our area. So again, I'm gonna go ahead and put my dubbing on. I've wet my thread, I wet my fingers, and I'm doing that kind of rolling pattern with my fingers to roll this dubbing around the thread. Now you also will see, usually after I finish, I've got this gap of thread. So there's a couple ways that we can get rid of that gap. One is you can very carefully just kind of move your dubbing noodle down. Or two, you can take and just wrap your thread until you reach the dubbing. Kind of your choice. So I'm going to go ahead and now start wrapping the dubbing around the body. Kind of pulling it every once in a while to make sure it's, on there nice and tightly. Start advancing forward. Now I'm going to come back just a bit because I need to dub some more in. I want to keep that body nice and tapered. So again, just put on another bit of dubbing. Advance forward. And just keep putting it on in small bits until you get up to that parachute post and we're ready to tie in our hackle feather. Okay, so I've got the back part of my fly in place and I'm ready to tie in my feather. So I'm going to go ahead, advance my thread slightly to be able to tie it in. I actually already have a feather ready to go. Now I don't have an orange dry fly feather. I haven't seen too many orange chickens, but this brown works really well. And this also allows me to, okay, as long as the color is close enough, fly won't care, or the fish won't care, right? And it's going to allow me to have more versatility to tie different types of dry flies. So this one's already ready to go. In fact, I've already tied one or two with this feather. So I'm going to go ahead and prepare it just like we've seen. Basically just cutting back along that stem gives us some nice points to tie into. And we're going to lay it at that angle. So again, we didn't strip everything off to a bare shank because see how that whole hook shank bends? It's because this thread has gotten trapped in between those individual fibers that we just trimmed and gave that haircut. That's the best way to make sure that this feather is just not going to pull out from your threads while you're tying in your dry. So we're going to go ahead and start wrapping up till we get to the top, and we'll wrap back down. And Stu, we won't trim our thread off this time because I'll show you how I will finish this without super glue. I'm still going to put super glue in just because it's going to make this fly that much more durable. So, sorry, I forgot we got to dub the front, don't we? So let's go ahead and put that dubbing on, and then we'll be ready to finish this fly off. So again, pull out some more dubbing, wet my thread, rinse and repeat, right guys? I'm going to do this again. And there we go. Now, I'm actually going to put a little bit more dubbing on, Stu, because I know that I'm going to finish this fly with the thread. So I'm actually going to allow myself to have a little bit of dubbing to kind of cover that up when I put those knots in. I'll put one or two wraps. Let's take off that last wrap. There we go. So we're going to go ahead now and leave our thread in place, but put wrap our feather around our parachute. And again, I'm still going to use my super glue because this just makes this so much more durable. Nothing's worse than having your dry fly hackle come undone. All right, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to wrap this around the hook shank, or not hook shank, I apologize, around the parachute post. And again, we're going to be doing this with only as much tension as is needed to get it to wrap around. If I pull too hard, we'll pull the entire parachute post down. So I'm trying to put each wrap just below the last. If I get down to the bottom, I'll put an extra wrap or two in to make it nice and dense. Now I'm ready to kind of take my hackle pliers and let that hang so that this doesn't come undone. Because I'm going to finish with this thread, I can go ahead and just continue to tie. So the way I'm going to do it, this is how I do it, is I will use my whip finisher. And I'm going to do this right around the bottom of this fly. So I'm going to be real careful when I do this. If you finish a fly this way, be really careful that you don't capture all of those hackle fibers. So I'm only going to do 3 turns. And then go ahead and undo. This is one way to do it. Another way, if you're not comfortable, sorry, yeah, bottom of the post. Thanks, Jeff. If you're not comfortable whip finishing around the post, then what you can do, and this is a little bit harder, is advance your thread up to the hook eye and either whip finish or half hitch around there. That's more difficult because now we have these fibers coming forward, right? So in general, this is actually a lot harder to finish a fly this way. So Stu, you're asking, so none of those crisscross or X pattern tie-in? No, because we're actually finished the fly. And believe it or not, when I was doing the whip finish, what that's actually doing is laying a series of half hitches around this the hackle feather. So usually we do this kind of like those crisscrosses when we're going to continue to tie forward. But because we've actually finished around this parachute post, we don't actually need to do those because we're doing those as we do the whip finish. So hopefully that makes sense too. So now I'm actually ready. I can come in. And even if the glue's not dry, it's actually still going to hold in place because I've held that feather in place using my thread. Now, notice that even though I try to be as careful as possible, I actually have a whole bunch of strands coming straight down because you will almost always capture a little bit of that hackle feather when you try to whip finish. Some can without, but I'm not that good and it's actually quite difficult. So what I'll do is I'll actually come back in and I'll just cut those away to make a fly that looks a little more uniform. But if you just do the super glue technique, this almost never happens. And you get a hackle feather that actually lays so much nicer. But you know, both ways work. And if you don't have the super glue, then it's, you know, certainly, you know, possible and plausible to finish your fly off with just the thread. And I'm going to go ahead and trim that indicator, and that's it. That's the so now we've tied an October caddis, just because we don't have a tail on it in a size 10. So you know, we're right at our hour mark. So hopefully you guys learned a little bit on how to tie some dry flies. Like I said, you can have so much fun with this pattern, right? So here's a March brown, just tied in a nice tan, nice dark brown color, right? So that's a different fly, but tied the exact same way. Here's a clink hammer. I've been kind of showing this off, but now you can really see, right? It's tied with a nice dark peacock curl in the front and some gray dubbing in the back, but it's a parachute dry fly, tied the exact same way, just on a curved hook. So, so Stu's asking about the actual competition. So Stu, there is a link in the description for this video, and that link is going to take you to the Virginia Museum of Natural History's page, and they'll go through and kind of explain the rules for it. What they have is they've got a couple of different insect species that they're asking fly tiers to tie up to imitate. One of them actually is a crayfish. So, the clawdad that we tied at the very beginning of this pandemic, when Project Healing Waters went virtual, you can certainly tie one of those and submit in. But they also had a sulphur mayfly, and that is what we tied tonight. So they actually have a couple different dry fly, or a couple different mayfly species. And just by changing the color, like I've showed you, you can actually imitate them while still tying the same way. So I encourage you to go and click on the link and take a look at those rules. And I think you just tie them up and then mail them in so they can take a look at them, because they'll take a few of the flies, and I believe they're actually going to showcase them. I don't want to speak exactly because obviously I'm not from the museum. But I encourage everyone on here to give it a try, right? There's you got nothing to lose. Tie up one or two and send out. If you do tie, please share the results. Put a comment in how it went, or send an email for those on the Project Healing Waters list. So Stu, we do have so Project Healing Waters every year does a fly tying competition. Now that is actually over for 2020 to submit the flies, and it's actually on our Facebook page. There's the voting link to actually vote for it. But you can certainly tie up dry flies for next year, for 2021. And if eventually we will get back together in person. And Stu, if you want to tie up dry flies for the Project Healing Waters competition, let me know, and we can work on them together. For that competition, you need to tie 5 of the same fly, and part of their judging criteria is in uniformness between each fly that you tie. So you should be able to tie 5 flies that look identical for it. But of course, you don't have to tie a dry fly for that either. You can tie anything that you want. For the museum, they're looking for very specific insects. So any other questions before we finish up tonight? I want to thank everyone that joined us, and I think we had 1 or 2 people that joined as well from outside of Healing Waters, so I'm glad you joined. Hopefully you learned something as well. And for those of you who are watching the recording, obviously you're not live, so but if you want to leave a comment, if you have any questions, we do look at those, and we will try to answer those as quickly as possible. So if there are no other questions, thank you all very, very much. Hopefully we demystified tying a dry fly a little bit, and something that you guys are willing to give it a go. And we are, I think I'll close it on this. We are blessed in Virginia that our brook trout will take dry flies year round. Now there are certain times of year when we don't fish for them, right now being as an example because they're all spawning. But once it gets safe to fish for them again, which depending on the stream could be as early as maybe in about 2 weeks, 3 weeks from now, then feel free to throw some dry flies for them. I personally have caught trout in the middle, brook trout or brook char, whatever you want to call them, in the middle of January during a snowstorm on dry flies. So bless their hearts. feel free to try it out and explore. So, all right, and we will see everyone in 2 weeks, as Jeff's put into the comments. I don't even know the fly pattern yet, so Jeff, I'm excited to see what you'll be tying up for everyone, and you'll see emails about that coming out. So thank you all very much, and have a great night.